Hey, what's up everybody? It's Dan Pickett here again at Launch Academy to bring you another episode of the HTML show. And today we're going to be focused on taking our mobile design and actually adapting it to support wider displays like tablets and traditional desktop displays. So we're going to use media queries to basically manipulate the layouts that we've already created, and we're going to basically expand it to make it look aesthetically pleasing in larger displays. So if you remember, we were using this theme that we found on, I believe it was, I'm trying to remember the theme site that we were looking at, but we basically used Theme Forest to find a design that we were excited about. And we started with a mobile design. And that was intentional because it's a lot easier to build your markup based on the constraints of a mobile design and then extracting that and expanding that outward. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. So we're going to take all of the work that we've done for our mobile design, and we're going to essentially identify breakpoints and media queries that we can use to essentially expand the layout and progressively enhance for wider displays. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. All right, so if you remember, we've got basically the full realization of everything that we have going in our responsive resume. We've got an example piece of experience as well as a piece of education. And we could certainly expand on these in the future, but for the purposes of our show here, I want to just basically cut to the chase of essentially identifying breakpoints and creating media queries so that we expand the design here and just make it look a little more pretty. All right, so let's dive in. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to come out of my mobile device toolbar in Chrome, and I'm going to expand outward. And I can already see that we've got a lot of work to do here. If you notice, as the layout kind of expands in the theme, we have some overhanging sort of iconography that's happening. Our social icons are justified all to the right. And just in general, I'm kind of just taking a survey of the entire set of changes that we have to make to this resume in order to achieve the aesthetic that we're going for. So it looks like we've got a handle for these sort of overhanging icons. We've got to move our definition list so that it's right justified next to the name and the title. And maybe we'll add the avatar image, which I believe was not showing up on the mobile display. So we want to make sure we add that and conditionally hide it when it's not shown in the mobile display. And it looks as well like we've got a layout issue here where the programming skills and the evergreen skills that we added, those are going to come to the right of our resume experience in our education. And what we may have to do with floats, as we explored further down here, we may actually have to expand on our employment in our education so that everything justifies properly. And one thing that we want to be paying particular attention to is how the white space changes. So notice the margin here. Let's just take a look at how that changes as we move to a mobile display. It looks like that is remaining fairly constant as the width of the layout expands. So we're pretty good there, assuming that our white space doesn't change as we expand our layout. And it looks like we don't. We use a pretty static white space there. So let's get to actually making these changes happen. And adapting for alternative displays is we're gonna approach that problem in the same way that we tackled the mobile display. We're gonna take every section one at a time and make it progressively enhanced per section as we work through. It's good to have context of the overall layout and the overall changes that you want to make. But at the end of the day, you kind of have to identify these little milestones for yourself to keep yourself motivated, to work through the project, and to kind of compartmentalize your problem solving. So we're very big proponents here at Launch Academy about decomposing the problem and focusing in on one problem at a time. So we're going to essentially take this responsive design project and do exactly that. We have a saying here, you know, how do you eat an elephant? You eat an elephant one scoop at a time. And that's what we're going to do as we adapt this mobile display. Cool. Okay, so let's dive in. So the first thing that we want to do is, We want to basically make those icons probably a little larger, and we want to justify them to the right. So we're going to do that for our social icons, and it looks like actually we could benefit from some white space in between them as well. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So we're looking at the social media profiles UL that we had previously styled. And we're probably not going to have to use any media queries for this particular adjustment because we're just making some font sizes and some white space adjustments. As we get further down the line, we'll actually have to make use of media queries. Okay, so social media profiles, we want to text align right. And we probably want to make those a little bit bigger. Let's make these 1.2 REMs. Let's see how that might be a little too big. Actually, that's pretty decent. I like that. And then for our LIs, we're just going to add a margin left of maybe 2.2 REMs. That's not really sufficient. Oops, I've got a typo, that's why. There we go. That's a little better. Let's go with a 0.3. When I'm kind of making these styling tweaks, I feel a little bit like Bob Ross. I don't know if you ever watch Bob Ross, but he liked to kind of comment on how he painted little trees. That's kind of the tweaking and the adjustment process that we're doing here. I feel like I should talk in a soft voice like Bob Ross now. These little social icons. Okay, sorry. It's Tuesday. I'm a little weird. You're used to it by now. It's totally fine. Okay. So notice we're ready to move on to the next section here. And notice we've got that new icon kind of hanging over the gutter, if you will. And then we also have a static width of the button. The button itself is not actually changing, the profile header. But in our model and example, it's actually adjusting as the width grows. And we really want to use a fixed width here. I think that's just a better experience. So we're going to go ahead and do that. All right, so let's take a look at the next section of our site. And we're talking about the resume component, the H3 tag here. Okay, so the H3 tag is going to be right here. And if you remember, we're actually using a percentage base width. And that's problematic, right? We don't want to use a percentage base width because as we expand the width of our window here, we're actually expanding the padding of that pseudo button, the header, profile, and resume. So we want to actually fix that and make it a pixel-based width. And what we can do is we can set a min width and a max width. Let's see what happens with the min width here. Yeah, max width 250 px. See how that goes. That's too much. Again, we're just kind of making adjustments and tweaking. And notice I'm not creating any conditional sort of styles at the moment. I'm just kind of tweaking our design as it sits to accommodate larger displays. And I'm kind of seeing how things change as I work through section by section. And that's pretty close to the behavior that we see here where profile stays pretty static. And what we want to do now is we want to have that icon that displays only if we're at a particular breakpoint. So this is where we first start to see our need for a media query, is when we basically introduce that gutter into the equation. And what's really critical about approaching mobile-first design is not necessarily setting your breakpoints according to traditional resolutions. For example, 800 by 600, 1200 by 1280 by 1024. You want to set those breakpoints really based on your layout and making it contextual to when a certain width enables you to achieve a greater aesthetic. And this is sort of that idea at its most fundamental of progressive enhancement. As a computer's capabilities, including its resolution, improves, we basically add decorative items to the page to make for a better experience for that particular paradigm. So at its fundamentals, we're talking about progressive enhancement. Okay, so we want to show this icon, and we're going to do it in the context of the H3. So I'm going to try a few things here. I'm going to say .resume component H3 I tag, and we're going to have to put this in a media query. And just to revisit the media query syntax, we're going to go to MDN and just make sure we have that right. I always kind of mess this up, so I want to make sure I have this correct for you. So we've got the parens, and then we're going to actually set a min width constraint. And using the tools that we have at our disposal, notice how the width indicators in the top right-hand corner of our display is kind of showing us how things change. We're going to actually take a look. Oh, it's blacked out in this particular case because they're using a black background. So we actually have to use the mobile tool here. Where's our device toolbar here? So we're going to reload this page. That's funny. Okay, we're going to reopen our Chrome inspector. I think it was kind of bound to our existing tab. And we're going to see when it enables that, that icon from displaying. It looks like the kind of trigger point or the break point here is at 500 pixels. And that seems pretty relevant for our approach, so we can adopt a similar min width. And we're going to put this rule inside that media component. And we're going to actually have to specify a contrarian viewpoint. Well, actually, we don't even need the media query. We can just hide it by default if we're practicing mobile-first development. And we're going to actually make this an inline block. And we're going to throw our icon in here using Font Awesome, which is just a great library. FA, and we need to look up the actual icon that we want to use. So we're going to go to the documentation. I need like a user O. Perfect. User O. Let's see if that does the trick for us. So we don't see the icon. It may be because this is a new version. It looks like Font Awesome. Oh, this is 4.7. Okay, good. FA user O. So on our larger displays, we should see that icon. It should display. Let's just see it and make sure our rules are applying here. So media queries result in a higher order of specificity. So this display inline block is taking precedent for wider displays, which is what we want. However, it looks like the icon itself is not rendering, which is a little funky. Color is white. So for the heck of it, I'm just going to throw in a character here just to see what's happening. Make sure my assumptions are correct. Interesting. Okay. So it looks like it's completely not rendering here, which is just funky. So we're going to specify a default width. And it looks like essentially what we're doing is we're adding roughly 75 pixels here. So maybe we had to specify our width. There we go. Now we're getting some decent behavior where we see a line break. So let's come out of device mode here and see if we can select that text. It looks like we can't. So I'm going to choose a different icon. And we know, for example, that Twitter works because we use it in the social icons above. So let's just try that and see if that's going to do the trick for us. Okay, yeah, so we're just using an icon that probably wasn't available to us in a previous version. All right, so looks like we have to avoid everything that's in the 4.7 and just go down to some of these other ones. So let's see what we have at our disposal. Just scrolling through, what do we got? User, perfect. Exactly what we want. All right. And because it's affecting sort of our static width, what I may actually decide is to actually take it out of the H3 tag, and it's kind of extraneous to it, in fact, anyway. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and we're going to match the style of our resume component here, our H3, in terms of color, background color, and so we can take all of these things and make them generalizable to .resume component I, and we want to update all of our CSS here to reflect these changes as well. And some of these rules are only going to apply to the H3. So we're going to isolate those, mainly the width and max widths. Probably set those specifically in the media query. All right, so we're making headway. Awesome. And we want to eliminate all the margin and padding between these two elements here. So we're going to set the H3's margin top to 0. And that should bring them closer together. Good. And now we're going to use absolute positioning to basically push this to the left. We're going to relatively position it, and we're going to base it off of the width that we're using here, and we're going to say left. Let's see how that renders. So that's pretty close. Excellent. All right. We've got an inline block, and essentially what we want to do is make it so this H3 doesn't clear off of that I. So I could use absolute positioning actually to do exactly that, and that's what I'm going to do. Now, in order to make the absolute basis on where it's going to show up, we actually have to set relative positioning inside the resume component here. So we're going to go up to resume component, and we're going to set position to relative. And this is a really confusing thing when we're talking about positioning in CSS3. But basically what we want to do is we want to set the positioning inside the container element to relative, so that when we use an absolute position in our resume component, it's based off of the container and not the body tag. So that's why we have to do that. All right, so we're making headway. And notice here that we've got an issue where the width of our whole layout here really doesn't accommodate larger displays. So as we show in the template here, as we get larger, the gutter, what we know as to the left and the right of the layout, that changes over time, right? So we need to actually have our layout also facilitate that kind of shift. And it's really hard to move forward until we do that, so we have to adjust that. So what we want to do is we want to essentially take a look at what's defining that width. And it looks like this is a function of the body. So maybe when we achieve that 500 pixels, we start to set a margin that is percentage based, say 10% of the available real estate. Let's see how that works. And there we go. Now we're getting a little bit more of an adjusting margin. And I only want to make that margin adjust horizontally. I don't want to make that margin adjust vertically. So I'm going to set our margin to 1 REM and 10%. Now we're in a better spot. So we're getting there, we're getting closer, right? So what we want to do is make some tweaks to this icon. For example, it's too wide and the icon itself is too small. So we want to make some tweaks back down there in the CSS. So you can see this iterative process where we're kind of expanding our horizons as we expand the width of our browser. So we're going to go down to our, and I'm using the Command R key here to kind of isolate the selection that I want. We're dealing with the media query here. So we want to decrease the width a bit. And if we decrease the width, we have to decrease the absolute positioning. And we want to make sure that our font size is matched in our H3 and in our resume component. They have to be the same size for it to look clean. That's a little too big, I think. Let's make it, granted I'm zoomed in by the way here for the benefit of the display. So let's make that 1.1. See how that goes. That's a little better. All right, great. Now we have to match our sort of margins and paddings here. Let's find out why these aren't lining up flush. So we've got an H3 with padding of 20. And we've got our I tag with padding of 20. So it looks like actually we've got a different height applied to our I tag versus our H3 tag, if you notice that. So what we need to do is actually set a height. Of say 25 pixels. That's not going to work. We're using a border box here, so we also need to consider the padding itself as part of the overall layout. So we want to say 25 plus 40 is going to give us 65 pixels. That's a little bit better. And we're still kind of hitting an alignment issue here, where our I tag is off kilter with our P tag here. So we get the static width, and then the icon itself should be vertically aligned in the middle, but it doesn't look like that rule is being applied. So I'm gonna cheat that just a little bit here, and I'm just gonna set a padding top to 5px and see if that's sufficient to get the aesthetic that we're looking for. Oops, I overrode the padding that we've defined up here. So I'm going to set the padding top to 25px. That's pretty close, maybe 23. That's better, awesome, cool. And notice we've got a little border here and the icon is bigger. So we want to make that icon bigger, which will also require us to kind of make some changes. And I think we can size it FA3. So we're going to size the icon with FA3 according to Font Awesome's documentation, see if that helps. Not really. So we actually want to increase the font size of the icon to make it look a little bit bigger than the H3. So we're going to do that. So the font size is 1.1 rem. Let's try making the icon itself 1.3. And that looks a little better. Let's make it even more dramatic. And then we've got to adjust our padding to achieve the alignment look that we're looking for. Well, let's just try to reset it, see what happens. And that looks actually fairly decent. So we're good there. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna add a border right. And it looks like it's kind of a black line. So we'll match the white to see if that does the trick. Yeah. We want to make sure we're text aligning center. We probably have some additions to make to the width here. So see how this is no longer centered in the overhang. That's not ideal. So we want to adjust this so that it's centered in the box, which it does not appear to be doing right now. So we're going to set a min width on the eye to say 50px. See if that does the trick. Pretty sure I already set that. So let's expand this min width then. Okay, that looks a little more square, certainly. So now what we can do is we can change this width to 75px and move it over 75px. And there we go. That's pretty decent. Removing some redundant rules here. want to really kind of bring that width down just a bit. It seems a little large. There we go. And we'll make the padding on the bottom and the top a little bit less pronounced. That's probably a little too much. There we go. So you can see how we go through this process of just iteratively tweaking to get the white space and the sort of the aesthetic that we're looking for. So we went through a lot of tweaking there to get to the direction that we wanted. And rather than using the white border, which is a little too interruptive here, I'm going to mimic the gray border that we introduced separating each resume component. So I'm going to match that rule. Rather than this white, I'm going to use that gray color, just for consistency's sake, and hopefully it'll look a little bit better. Yeah, I actually think I like the white better. So we'll go with the white. And we'll just stick with it. All right, so now I have this reusable sort of style sheet rule, and then I can use it and apply it to the rest of my sections. Oh, it looks like we've got some specificity issues here. So if you notice, we broke some of our other iconography. So we need to make a more specific selection here and essentially isolate that particular icon. So section icon. And we'll qualify all these new rules with that selection. All right, so this remains the same, and we didn't break some of the work that we had previously done. So now that I have this consistent sort of tab overhang, I want to apply it to the rest of my sections here. So really all we have left to do is the resume, and they use that icon. I think we should use like a doc kind of icon. So I'm going to look for a doc icon that Font Awesome provides. Kind of a page. Let's see, what do we have? What do we have? We could use the list if we wanted to. That's a strong contender. I actually like the file text. Let's go with that. So I'm going to take this markup and I'm going to go to the next H3. And I'm going to change the FA user to the file text. And let's see what that looks like. And that looks pretty great. So you can see here how we basically just duplicated that tab feel using well-defined CSS rules. And because of our media queries, these should go away once you approach that 500 pixel mark. And actually, I'm thinking about adjusting that breakpoint because look at that, that's not really a great experience. So why don't we do it based on the 500 pixels plus the width of the icons themselves. We made some adjustments. So we want to set that breakpoint to 560 px plus another 10 pixels on either side of margin. So we're basically making that a more, yeah, that looks much better. Good. We're basically making sure that those overhangs are only introduced when it's aesthetically pleasing. Awesome. Looks like we've got an extraneous eye up here that we want to get rid of as well. Just something I noticed. Oh, That was when we were debugging the other icon, I believe. All right, so we've got that done. So let's finish up this profile section and actually have it so that as we expand outward, we show an image and we show this definition list as kind of going beyond the width of the title here. So we've got kind of a three-column layout that kind of changes at certain breakpoints. So we want to show the icon after, say, 200 or 300 pixels of width, and then it looks like 560 again. And then at another breakpoint, we show all the definition list information to the right of the title. So we've got a little bit of work to do here. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a div with the same FA user icon. Normally we'd put a photo in here, but just for the purposes of illustrating this, we're just going to use an icon. Resume profile photo. And we don't want to show that profile photo when we're in our mobile display. So we're going to go down to our resume detail. And we're going to say for any profile photo in the resume detail, we're going to display none. But when we approach that min width of 560 pixels, we're going to actually make that an inline block. So you can see the box here now. We're in the process of improving that. So we're just going to refine that for our larger displays, but watch what happens as I shrink the width. We want that little gray box to go away. And it does. All right, so let's improve upon this little gray box here. So the profile photo. We're going to say we want the width to be static width, assuming it's an image. Let's make it 200 pixels and a height, say, of 400 pixels. Let's see how large that gets. So you can see how that affects our layout and subsequently breaks it. We're going to go way smaller in our profile photo. We're going to make the font size incredibly large to kind of bubble up that icon a little bit. We'll make it 5 REMs. It's going to be ridiculously big. There we go. And we're going to set background color. We're just kind of mocking this up for your benefit here. And we're going to text align center. All right, so then we need to dramatically decrease our height. That's probably still a bit too big. And we need to make the font size a little bit smaller. There we go. Okay, so now what we need to do is make it so that these elements actually show up to the left of the icon. So the first thing that we need to do is actually change our markup a bit so that those two items are related. We have to put these in a container div so we can get the behavior that we're looking for. So while not ideal, as you adapt your display and your approach using CSS in media queries, sometimes you do in fact need to make some changes to the markup itself. So we're going to say name container. And we're going to div.name container, and we'll also make that an inline block. Let's see how that affects things. Great. Okay, so now we've got that wonderful kind of separation, and then we need to add some white space between the two. So we can do that here. We'll do 0.4 REMs here. That's some nice white space. Let's make it even more significant. There it is. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. It looks like they kind of have the person's name and title a little off-center. I actually like it centered, so I'm gonna maintain it to be that way. You can see as we shift this out, that image disappears, which is by design. And then when we cross that 560 threshold, the image reappears. Here, let me turn the inspector off just to make that a little more clearer. So we hit that breakpoint at 560, and the image disappears, and the image appears. So you can see how media queries affect the display of our page. Okay, so the next thing for us to determine is, do we want this list to show all the way to the right? And that's actually a component of this theme that I don't necessarily like. So we're gonna deviate from this approach, and we're actually gonna make this list appear directly below the photo and the name. And we've got a little bit of a challenge there in that, if you remember, our definition list here has some significant margin left on it, or some padding left on it. So what we need to do is we need to adjust this so that when we're dealing with wider displays, it's actually left justify. So we're going to use media queries again. Media queries to the ref SKU. We're going to go down to that definition list. And rather than having our text align right, we're going to have our text align left. Let's see how this works. See if this. So now we need to just bring this material over, which means we may have to adjust the width to be a little bit more reasonable. And we can actually set the max width to say 200 pixels. To kind of match the photo width is probably the best thing to do here. So we want to match the profile's photo width, which is 90 pixels. And that looks pretty good. So you see how we essentially expand outward, and it just makes the ability to create media queries infinitely easier. It's just way easier to expand outward rather than adapting what you've done for wider displays and make it a mobile version. So that's why mobile first design just ends up being a way more productive way of getting responsive designs done. All right, in our second episode coming up later this week, we'll basically adjust the rest of the resume, and that will round out our project. I hope you join us, and by all means, if you have any questions about the Launch Academy program or what we're doing here with the HTML show, I hope you'll join us in the Slack chat. If you're just tuning in for the first time, leave us a comment and tell us why you're watching. I'd love to hear from you. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks.